Welcome back to this study on the Gospel of John. Let's start with a word of prayer. Father, Lord, we ask that you be with us this evening. Help us to understand your word, that your word will open up our hearts to inspire love, faithfulness, and fidelity to your word. We ask this for Jesus' sake. Amen. Right, so let's look at where we are in the Gospel of John. You've got the first Passover, chapter 1 to chapter 5. Second Passover, chapter 6 to about 11. And this is basically the final year of Jesus' ministry. And then from chapter 12 onwards to 21, which is the second half of the Gospel of John, we're talking about the third Passover and the final few days. So all this is like the final year, and this is compressed few chapters all into the final day, final few days, where the third Passover, where Jesus is actually sacrificed. And here is chapter 11, which is the final year of Jesus' ministry. We're talking about the most spectacular sign that Jesus performed. Out of the 7 signs, the book of signs ends with this sign of the resurrection of Lazarus. Well, there are a couple of lessons. 1, delays don't mean abandonment. 2, an understanding a strong sense of destiny empowers us. Number 3, Jesus is the resurrection and the life. 4, Jesus' response to Lazarus shows us the heart of God in our suffering. And 5, the glory of God is for the good of man. Delays do not mean abandonment. Now, there's a certain man who was ill, and Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed Jesus with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. Now, you have to understand, this Mary who anointed Jesus is actually a reference to John chapter 12. So actually, the Gospel of John is not necessarily in chronological order. There are certain things that are put forward and put back in order to fit what John wants to portray. So this Mary is the one who anointed Jesus with the hair, with her tears, and the alabaster jar with ointment. Right? So the sister sent to him saying, "Lord, he whom you love," obviously from the sisters is Lazarus, but when Jesus heard it, "this illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Right? And then Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place he was, and after that he said to his disciples, "Let's go to Judea again." You know, if they tell you your uncle is sicker and you really love him very much, would you wait 2 extra days? It's a bit odd, isn't it? Right? If you actually love them, you go straight away. Most of us will go straight away, right? He actually did this in order to test their faith, right? All right? Because he wanted to perform a miracle in their midst. And then he would be going to Judea. There's a whole chapter, there's a whole passage on them going to Judea, why it was dangerous to go to Judea. So we're not going to deal with this yet. We'll leave that for a little later on. Verse 11 to 15. After saying this, he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going to awaken him." And the disciples said to him, "Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he will recover." And Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he meant taking rest in sleep. And Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus has died. And for your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let's go to him." So what happens 2 days later on when he talks, he said to them, and he used a word, he's fallen asleep. To basically, to Jesus, death is like sleep, not a big deal. To us, death is the end. And those who Jesus said, "You know, my friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. I'm going there to awaken him." He's actually downplaying it a wee bit. But they misunderstand. They think, you know, if he's really asleep, he'll wake up again. Why bother going? And Jesus clarifies. Now, Jesus has spoken of his death. They thought that he meant taking rest in sleep. Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus has died. And for your sake, I'm glad I wasn't there, because you wouldn't have mistaken resuscitation from actually resurrection," right? You actually there was a movie some time ago with that famous actress called Eileen Page, called Flatliners, who grew up young people who are experimenting to find what is beyond death. They actually put themselves, they use electrical current to stop their hearts for about 3 minutes, and after about 3 minutes, the pump, they would actually electrocute themselves, get a cardioversion, and they will come back to life again, and then they will describe what happened. But there's only a very short window, 3 minutes, beyond which there will be permanent brain damage and they wouldn't be able to live. So there's a difference between resuscitation, which you want to resuscitate someone who's actually fallen down and it's hard to stop. You only have 3 minutes. There's a difference between that and resurrection. All right? Now, if you actually resuscitate someone, it's no big deal. Even a doctor can do that. If you actually resurrect someone, that is a very, very big deal. All right? And so there's a purpose behind everything. All right? And here you actually have Jesus actually delaying. Why does he delay? He delays because in Jewish thinking, if you're already 4 days later on when you come, a man is well and truly dead. They thought his spirit hung around for the first 2-3 days, and there are people who wake up after 2-3 days. So they were not actually dead. But if you come and see him 4 days, he's actually smelling, he's absolutely dead. So there's no question about the authenticity of his death, nor the authenticity of his resurrection later on. So whatever outcome that comes here is actually for the glory of God. Sometimes you have a situation when you're cured. Success story, we all say, fantastic, glorifies God. You get the guy up to testify. But if you're not cured, it's basically a failure and it doesn't glorify God. But you have to understand there's a purpose behind every action, and every action accentuates God's glory. There's an opportunity for that. Because if you're not cured, your opportunity to glory in God's miraculous sustaining power. Let's take, for example, Lazarus and this famous lady whose name is Joni Eareckson, who basically crashed into a pool and broke her neck and was paralyzed from neck downwards. All right? Lazarus, the power of Jesus was shown over death itself in Lazarus. In Joni Eareckson's life, the power of Jesus was shown over life itself, not death. How she was sustained in her faith through her life. The historical context prepares the disciples for Jesus' own resurrection. Because Lazarus resurrected, they could look forward and it would be no surprise to them to see that Jesus, the one who raised someone from the dead, could also himself be raised. The historical context of Joni Eareckson's quadriplegia was that the world would see meaning in suffering. The historical context provokes the Pharisees to issue the order to arrest and kill Jesus. That is the seminal event that triggers the death sentence. For Joni Eareckson, her quadriplegia highlights God's grace and sustaining power. Lazarus' death and resurrection produces devotion and faith in Mary and Martha as well as all the disciples. Joni Eareckson's continued life of faith in a wheelchair produces enduring faith, spiritual maturity all over the world. If you look at the man born blind and Job, the power of Jesus over blindness in the man born blind in John chapter 9. In Job, the power of God over circumstances where he was rich and then he became poor and ill and then God brought him back again. Fulfills, for a man born blind, fulfills the prophecy of Messiah, opening the eyes of the blind. For Job, his suffering showed us the fact that God didn't bring it out of the suffering immediately, shows us and Job's friends, righteous people can also suffer for no apparent reason. The historical context demonstrates how, for this man, the seeing Pharisees were deliberately blind, and the honest blind man could easily see, so which actually accentuates the blindness and guilt of the Pharisees. For Job, his suffering demonstrates to Satan that Job loves God, not just for the good things God has given him, but for God himself. The miracle of healing the blind man in chapter 9 of John produces faith in the blind man and the people with whom he shared with later on. And God's intervention in the life of Job, allowing evil to fall upon him and suffering, produces enduring faith in a different dimension and spiritual maturity. You see, each action needs to be interpreted as God's purposes behind. Each event that happens to us is determined by the absolute wisdom and the sovereign power of God. The important thing is our response. We actually respond with spiritual blindness, or we respond with faith. We need to understand the strong sense of destiny liberates us. Let's go back to this passage which we actually skipped over at first. And after this, he said to the disciples, let's go to Judea again. And the disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews are just now seeking to stone you. Are you going to go there again? And Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he doesn't stumble because he sees the light. If anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. Well, the passage is based on the question, if we go down to Judea, won't we get stoned and die? So basically, what happens is that Lazarus is in Judea, and in order to go and resurrect him, you've got to go down. But the disciples say, oh, well, you go down there, they're going to lynch us because you're there. They think that you're blaspheming, you're calling yourself son of God, and if you go down, they're going to lynch you, right? If we go down, we all get stoned and die. And Jesus answers them by using the metaphor of daytime and nighttime. And what he's saying is that while there is daytime means a time where God is set apart for Jesus to do his work. In that time, he will be protected, and during this limited period of time, he will be allowed to do his work. When the night comes, you won't be able to do work because the time will come when Jesus will be unable to work. Nighttime when all the protection will be removed and God will allow the forces of evil to be unleashed and Jesus will be crucified. So therefore, the spiritual application is that we should all have, like Jesus, a sense of divine destiny. We all have a purpose and a mission, and we will be completely protected until that mission is complete. And so therefore, we should conduct our lives and our mission with boldness, with resolve, and with guidance from God. Just like Jesus. And there's an irony. Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let's go. Let's go lah. We all died together with him. Actually, when they went down, the disciples didn't share the death with Jesus, but this is ironically put there. You know why? Because Thomas and all the other disciples actually did die because of their testimony for Jesus later on. Thirdly, Jesus is the resurrection and the life. And when Jesus came, Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days in the hot climate. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. And when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. And Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now, I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha said to him, well, I know he will rise again in the resurrection, the last day, which means she misunderstood. When Jesus said to her, you will rise again, he meant now, but she thought in the last days. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live, and everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? And so we all live under the shadow of death. And how we actually deal with death is 3 ways. We deny death. We hide the disturbance caused by the ugliness of death. We don't talk about it. Somebody talks about death, I see, you must be more positive. All right? And you're so busy denying death because that this fear controls you. Or we can actually sentimentalize death. We dress it up. We face death and say, oh, it's your friend. It's a beautiful thing. We're passing from one thing to another. It's a natural thing. It's a final thing. We sentimentalize it. But that's like putting lipstick on a pig. It doesn't quite work because when you go to a funeral, how many funerals have you attended where death is regarded as a friend? It's not a friend. It rips loved ones apart. And however way we want to sentimentalize death, it doesn't work. Or we fight death to overcome it. Here we have got the Greek historian Herodotus, who actually believed there's a fountain of youth. You go there and bathe in it, you will live forever. And that's actually what motivated Alexander the Great to conquer the known world, to find this. He was on a quest to find the fountain of youth. But ironically, the man who conquered the world to find the fountain of youth died in his 30s. And we have today billionaires like Peter Thiel, Larry Ellison, putting lots of money in order to do research, genetic research, to prolong life. And by gene therapy, we actually can double the life of roundworms, we can extend mice by 30% the life, and the fruit fly by about 50%, but that's about it. Perhaps others think about downloading their true self into the computer where we can be booted up forever. Well, Paul says no. The only way we can overcome death is through the life of Jesus Christ. Death is swallowed up in victory. Oh, death, where is your victory? Oh, death, where is your sting? Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. And this brings us back to John chapter 1 when he says, all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. You see, the hope of resurrection and life is in a person, not an ideology, not in some sort of thinking. It is in a person of Jesus Christ. And it's a promise for everyone. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. Whoever and everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. And do you believe this? What he's talking about is basically the resurrection life. Whoever believes in him, though you may physically die, yet you will physically live in the resurrected world. And whoever lives also will never die, in the sense that he will have, when he actually inherits the resurrected life, he doesn't really die in that sense. So I am the resurrection life, and he's referring to the eternal resurrected life, Zoe. Right? Now, human expectations and divine reality. So here you have a whole bunch of people who, on this side of the fence, have no experience of the power of God. And they've got human expectations. And then on the other hand, the things God does, we don't really understand because there's divine reality. All they could think of, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. And some of the people who actually saw Jesus come thought he had come too late. And some of them said, could he not have opened the eyes? The one who opened the eyes of the blind man also kept this man from dying. See, the whole focus is keeping this man from dying, because death was that particular bridge across which you cannot cross. No one has ever crossed it and come back. So therefore they're talking about Jesus didn't come on time. He should have come on time. He stopped this man from dying. That is why this particular miracle was instituted, in order to show them God's power beyond death. There was, during the time of the Holocaust, people in Auschwitz, the Jews, and they were terribly disappointed because God had them as a chosen people and God had abandoned them. They actually put God on trial, because if God was really their God, he would not allow them to be put into the gas chambers of Auschwitz, wouldn't he? It's here we are like the human expectation. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. Could this guy who had opened the eyes of the blind man not kept this man from dying? We're on this side, and we're trying to judge God on the other side. And this is Stephen Fry, an atheist. He writes, I love how when people watch, I don't know, David Attenborough or Discovery Planet type thing, know where you see the absolute phenomenal majesty and complexity and bewildering beauty of nature, and you stare at it, and then someone next to you goes, and how can you say there's no God? Look at that. And then he writes, 5 minutes later on, you're looking at the life cycle of the parasitic worm, whose job is to bury itself in the eyeball of a little lamb, eat the eyeball from the inside while the lamb dies a most horrible, agonizing death. And then you turn to him and say, yeah, where's your God now? So we judge God on this side of reality. We can't see this side, and we use that to judge him. And the divine reality is for, verse 4, it is for the glory of God that the Son of Man may be glorified. So this death is actually working in order to bring glory to God. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, he shall live. Everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe in this? This statement cannot be true until it is demonstrated through the resurrection of Lazarus. During World War II, there's a gentleman called Alan Turing, actually immortalized in a movie now, who actually invented the computer. And what they did was actually they broke the Nazi code. They captured a machine called an Enigma machine, where the Nazi generals would type in a certain message which would then be encrypted and sent to the soldiers who will then execute their orders. They captured this machine. Alan Turing actually managed to decipher it, and every time the Nazis gave an order, the British already had the order and they knew what to do and how to counter the move. But during the movie, there was a part where one of the ciphers or the people working with Alan Turing had discovered a ship would have been torpedoed, was ordered to be torpedoed by the German High Command. Message sent to the submarine. He could have, and the problem was his brother was on that ship. He knew that in advance that ship would be torpedoed, and yet he had a dilemma. If he had told the brother secretly on the ship that they would be torpedoed, all they had to do is just change correct course, change course. But if they changed course, then the Nazis would know that somehow the order had been intercepted and their Enigma machine and the code had already broken. They would not use it anymore and Britain would lose the war. So he kept quiet. And thousands of people were killed and soldiers were killed when that ship was torpedoed. See, a lot of things happen for the greater good of which you do not understand. Only God could stand back and see prosperity he had, catastrophe he had, and prosperity he had later on. In one single moment in time, God could see all that and have this perspective. We don't have the perspective. Our story of prosperity, catastrophe, everything all, we need perspective. The perspective is that Jesus gives us is that he is the resurrection and the life. When you put this block here, our whole life makes sense. Without this block here, nothing makes sense. And she said, Lord, I believe. I believe you are the Christ, the Son of God who's coming in the world. Jesus' response to Lazarus shows us the heart of God in our suffering. God is not immune to our suffering. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews had come to her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. And the Jews said, see how he loved him. And some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? And the word I want to point you to is he was moved in his spirit. The word moved in spirit is embryomai, which is actually found in extra biblical Greek, and it refers to snorting horses. You know, it refers to the emotion of indignation, outrage, and anger. Why was Jesus angered and indignant and outraged? Well, because of the two things. Because of the ugliness of sin. He was moved by the grief of people who were crying as if they had no hope, angry at the tragedy of death caused by sin, and also angered by the unbelief that the women and the Jews were grieving like pagans without hope in the world. So this shows us the love of God. Where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. And the word here, verse 5, the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. You could have used the word klaio, which is basically the weeping of Mary and the Jews. But John used the word dakrio, which means it's a lament before calamity. It doesn't mean it's hopeless. So here you see the nature of Jesus' sorrow, where he empathizes with people. Here Jesus is deeply moved again. He came to the tomb. It was a cave and the stone was laid against it. And Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead for 4 days. All right, so they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Lord, Father, I thank you that you heard me, and I knew that you always hear me. And I said this on account of people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. And then when he said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the man who had died come out, his hands and feet bound with linen, and his face wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. Jesus said, in verse 40, he said to her, did I not tell you that if you believe, you would see the glory of God? The glory of God is Jesus is the Messiah. He's the resurrection and life. Even in death, he can be trusted, for he will do nothing other than that which displays the glory of God. It is not this man, it's the same thing as the blind man. The blind man was actually born blind in chapter 9. But the reason he is given is that not that this man has sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. You know, there was a funeral some time ago, and there was a pastor called Bob Diffenbach who was attending, and he actually said, you know, this young woman who died of cancer, this woman, it was not God's will for this woman to die. We don't take death lightly, but there is a purpose behind it. Death does glorify God because death reveals God to be holy and just. When he said to Eve, if you take from the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, you will die. All right? And death does glorify God because it reveals that God is holy and just. It demonstrates that death is the last enemy that God will defeat in Christ Jesus. And there's also the victorious testimony of the saints in the face of death. So death does glorify God. Does God cause evil to occur? No. Evil occurs out of the free will of man. Evil is not outside the sovereign control of God. And God can use evil for good or rightly glorify his name. Now, when Jesus had died, and for your sake, I'm glad I wasn't there, that you may believe. This is verse 15. Lazarus has died, and for your sake, I'm glad I wasn't there, so that you may believe. They can experience another dimension. This is the final dimension of Jesus' glory. You've got a whole series of 7 miracles, 7 signs, and the highlight of the sign is that they have experienced resurrection. Jesus did in chapter 20 of John, Jesus did many other signs of presence of the disciples that were not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. So the purpose of John's gospel is achieved. There's another dimension of his glory, which is important because this is the one that we are all going to face one day, and trust in him for this. If you look, the same illustration I gave you in the previous chapter, why is the fire extinguisher red? Why is the exit door of the aeroplane highlighted red or glorified? Because they will point us to the way out in case of an emergency. The glory of God is for the good of man. There was a story told by David Watson, who wrote in his book, Fear No Evil, of 2 fathers. One is a Christian and one is non-Christian. One of them had his son die of leukemia at the age of 4. The other actually died because he was drowned accidentally in a swimming pool. One of them, through the agony of death, couldn't understand, and he condemned God, and as a Christian became a non-Christian. The other one, exactly almost the same kind of death, his young son died, saw through the pain the beauty, the grace of God, and actually came to know Christ. That death will drive us towards or away from God. Right? Same like the vaccination message. You can either divide yourself to belief or unbelief. People will actually line up and have their vaccination taken, or the same message will cause anger and demonstration and unbelief. And that happens here. For Martha and her sister Mary, they were devoted, they experienced this dimension that Jesus is the resurrection and the life. And same thing for the disciples. For the Pharisees, John chapter 11, verse 53 is the dividing line. On that day, they made plans to put him to death. May God add a blessing to the reading of his word. Thank you.